Bienvenue, mes amis. Oh, I meant bonjour. Wow. Bonjour, mes amis. Bienvenue à .NET API Review. Uh, I realized that last week I was like counting the issues when like there's a number up here. So there are 11 things potentially on the agenda today. Um, let's see if we can get through half. First up, uh, MECM memory cache add read-only span of char get API 110504. Can anyone talk about this one? Or are we waiting on specific people?
I assume we need Mark.
Okay. No one's here for this one yet, so we'll jump to allow exception marshalers via return marshal using on generated COM interface methods without preserved SIG, runtime 109522.
I know we have Sergio here. Do we have anyone from Interop here? And particularly, it'd be nice if Aaron or Jeremy was available.
Yep.
Yeah, I can add context to this, but we definitely want either Aaron or Jeremy.
Okay, well, we'll give them time to show up. Maybe it'll be an all Steve day. Uh, random get string and get hex string, runtime 11195 or 6.
So we added these to random number generator several releases ago at the same time as we were adding APIs to both random and random number generator. And for whatever reason, we only added these few to random number generator, not to random. Um, I think there was an argument that they'd be less likely in a non-cryptographic context, but lately I've been helping a variety of code bases move to .NET 8 and optimize for .NET 8, and I keep coming across places where people are manually doing this themselves. And forget for all these, I can use string.create and call get items in the callback. For hex, I can encode the string of 0 through 9 and A through F, but as little helpers, I it bothered me initially when we made that decision, and it still bothers me that these are just missing, and a developer is either forced to write the more complicated code or move to the cryptographically secure random number generator when they don't necessarily otherwise need it. So for these, I'm not sure why we would choose to just not have symmetry between the non-cryptographic and cryptographic random number generator.
I'm curious, have you seen people who wanted get hex string or just get string?
No, get hex string too. I mean, it's possible they didn't, you know, think to include a larger set of things, but folks using it for creating IDs for storing in a file system or storing in a cloud storage, and they just need a random identifier. And for whatever reason, they were using hexadecimal.
Fair enough.
The get string is certainly the more important one because then you can easily do the get hex string just by hard coding the hex characters. But so that's the most important one to me.
Okay. Uh, Kevin asks, should any of these be virtual?
So I'm following the same approach that we took with all the other methods that we added to random of late, like get items, which these are all based on effectively, where we chose not to make them virtual. Um, I think they should either all be virtual or none of them should be virtual, so I followed suit.
Okay, because I know with the batched random PR, we then had to do the virtual behind the scenes.
Yeah, that happens in most of the existing ones. So I'm not entirely sure why we didn't make the existing ones virtual, but for whatever reason we didn't. So I think these should be the same as get items. If we want to go make get items virtual, we can.
Is that a safe change this week?
I think
Well,
changing to virtual isn't guaranteed because the compiler in some cases, and they don't guarantee which cases, will decide to emit a direct call rather than a callvert.
yeah, if I remember correctly, in particular, it used to always do a callvert, and then when the nullable, what's it called, nullable coalescing operators came about, in those particular cases, it didn't necessarily emit a callvert. That said, I'm pretty sure we've made things virtual since then.
Presumably, the get hex string that returns the string is just going to be a call to string create and passing, and then with a delegate that calls back to get hex string the span version.
I imagine, yes, although I imagine get hex string, we can look at what we do on random number generator because these are exactly the same APIs there. But if I were just implementing it right now, get hex string would just call get string with the, 0 through 9 and A through F. And get string would then do the whole string.create get items dance.
And do we not need get string that takes a span destination?
We have it, it's called get items.
Okay. It feels like that might be one where having another API named get string might make it clearer for usage. Even
Possibly.
if it,
But again, I don't believe we have that on random number generator, do we?
I don't. Nope, just the one get string.
Okay.
Because get string was really intended for, getting a string, as in system.string, and then with hex string, for one reason or another, we then allowed the span writing one, which it has a very different implementation in the CSPRNG than get items because it knows it's completely saturating the space, so it doesn't need to look at the items count or whatnot. So, but saying we're making one look like the other is reasonable.
Yeah. I would maybe lean slightly towards exposing it on random, even if we didn't on random number generator, just because random is more forefront to typical users than something in cryptography, which is more specialized scenarios, but that's not a strong preference. It's just something that I imagine someone's going to come in a few months from now and go, hey, there's this one, where's this other one? And then we'll have to say, oh, it's just get items.
My preference would be to not, but I don't feel strongly either.
Yeah, I want to say that the people who are looking for a span writing one would be smart enough to maybe not figure it out, but be like, fine. I see why this is different, because this is the generic one and this is not.
I mean, maybe if we were really going for consistency last time on random number generator, we should have called the get hex string that takes a destination. We should have called that get hex items or something. But say Levy.
Levy. I feel like we did get these before we did get items. So we may not have had the naming to fall back on. That could be wrong.
Yeah, I'd be fine just adding the one get string, but that one I think is pretty valuable. Get hex string was just there for consistency. It's not hard to have the const.
All right. All right. Any other feedback? Sold. Analyzer proposal. Recommend using JsonElement.Parse because nobody likes Jeremy's JSON document.parse 111957.
So in general, I'd love for us to get back to the thing we had initially tried to do a few years ago and kind of got away from, which was every time we add a new API that's sort of meant to be the replacement for some other common pattern, we add analyzers. And that's what this is doing. We recently approved a new JsonElement.Parse API. It's linked to from above. And that issue lists several common ways that people do this, such as the one that's currently on the screen, which will not return an array pool array to the pool. So I'd like for us to have an analyzer that flags those patterns and recommends switching to the new API when it's available.
Seems reasonable to me. You think this is high enough for warning, or are we going for info?
I would go for info. And category is probably performance.
Given that the fixer is trivial in this case, couldn't we just make it a warning so that people quickly move to the new API?
I really don't want, in general, upgrading SDK to break people's apps.
Okay.
Unless there's a strong, unless it was actually a bug, like a functional or reliability bug, then maybe. But for something where it's mainly about improving performance and simplicity, I don't think it warrants breaking.
Okay.
Just to confirm, Eric, that is the implication here. Like all the patterns you cited, they're all functional. They're just not ideal, right?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, what's happening is that you're just subtracting from the array pool. That's it.
Right. So it just means an extra allocation later on.
Yeah.
Okay.
System.Linq.Shuffle 111221.
I guess I can try speaking to that. So this basically is an extension of the System.Random.Shuffle method, but applied to link, which means that rather than in-place shuffling, this would be producing a new enumerable that would be providing a permutation based on the random source you've been given. Now, there are a few concerns to be considered, which may or may not make this proposal even viable. For the better known shuffling algorithm to work, you actually need to know the size of the collection ahead of time. So it works really well with list-like things that are finite, and you get like uniform distribution when you do that. But if you have enumerables that could be potentially infinite, then the uniform distribution isn't actually possible. So we were debating in this issue whether we, actually do want to extend support for infinite enumerables, and if we do that, then a different algorithm would need to be used, namely, get the name. But effectively, you would be keeping a pool of things as you iterate and sampling from that pool, which means that there would be bias towards the kind of initial elements, reservoir sampling. That's it.
Wouldn't you also need to keep track of what you already yielded, which effectively means with an infinite sequence, you'd still need an infinite buffer?
I suppose that you'd be removing the items you've yielded from the reservoir in what way?
I see. Okay.
Again, this means that, in a way, you might be violating the list scope substitution principle, because, if the enumerable was an I-read-only list, then I'm guessing would be using something akin to the random.shuffle algorithm. But if we couldn't actually tell what the count is before enumeration, we'd need to instead go back to reservoir sampling, which fundamentally changes the distribution characteristics.
I guess I'm not clear why we would, like, we don't care about the possibility of infinite sequences in order by or reverse or take last or any of those.
Yeah.
Why would it be more of an issue here?
So for order by and reverse specifically, like, you need to be able to enumerate towards the very end of the sequence, because for correctness, that's needed for something like order by or reverse. Like, you need the final sequence in the second case, you need the maximum sequence or the minimum sequence in the first case.
But that's
In the
arguably
case
also the
of
case for shuffle, because if you're yielding items before you get the last element, you've changed the possibility that you could ever get the last element as the
True.
first.
True, and this manifests as, the distribution not being uniform, which, I don't know, like, depending on the use case, we might tolerate, we might consider that this is tolerable. But we couldn't do the same thing in order by or reverse, because then we'd be objectively be returning incorrect results.
I guess it doesn't. It's true that it's impossible with order by, but it still feels like it's wrong for this to say, yes, we're shuffling the elements, but all the elements we haven't yet enumerated.
True. Yeah.
Yeah, I
That
mean,
is
like,
true.
how would you even know how much to take before you decided to start yielding? It's not like
Good question.
IEnumerable tells you, hold on, I'd have to do more work now. I mean, it does. It literally every time it tells you I was able to do more work, but it doesn't tell you this is the last item. It tells you that was the last item.
That may well be an input in the method, in which case, if you had an optional parameter in the method, and the cases where you have an I read only list of t, then that parameter would be using count as a default. But again, like, we might decide that we are overcomplicating things, and I have no clear answer here, but we might decide that we're better off just enumerating to the end and then running the sampling algorithm as before, and that would make the implementation simpler as well.
I mean, it really feels like the whole implementation of this is return random.shuffle of to array.
Yep.
Yeah, with the I agree with that statement 100%. With the possibility that in certain cases we could optimize it further.
I can't. I mean, unless it's an I list and the count is 0. I don't know how we would do anything that is functionally better than that. To
Well, for
array is already
example,
going to pre-allocate the array if it knows the length.
if the input, like we do a bunch of things in LINQ where we pass information from one query operator to the next. So for example, with the API usage on the screen, shuffle.take3 could do a whole lot better than allocating an array for the full thing. It could allocate an array for 3 and choose 3 randomly.
Fair enough. If we have the data propagation of mixing a shuffle with a take, yeah.
Yeah.
But somebody just for eaching shuffle, it feels like that's just going to devolve to return shuffle of to array, or I don't even remember if shuffle returns the array. So to array
unless we
shuffle return.
unless we choose to diverge from things we've done elsewhere, like for whatever reason, reverse makes a full copy, even if it could just index directly into the source. You could imagine shuffle not having to produce a full T array. It might produce an int array, and then use that to yield from the original, array or I list. But we might choose not to do that for consistency reasons. And that's effectively what order by does. Order by makes a full copy and it allocates an int array of indices.
Interesting.
For stability reasons.
Yeah, I was gonna, so that if you're changing the data along the way, it still had a
No,
definite
for
order.
like sort stability, so that it can tell the difference between two elements that compare equally and know their original ordering.
Gotcha.
I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it definitely comes up. We have this even in our own tests. On the other hand, in the 99% case, it's taking a 2-liner and making it a 1-liner. And I'm not sure how I feel about System.Random showing up in LINQ surface area. It just feels a little wonky to me, but I can't put my finger on why.
Maybe because random isn't abstractable enough. Like we are basically using it as an ersatz source of entropy, which it isn't really.
It's also potentially restricting to the implementation. Random doesn't necessarily expose enough things so that we could, for example, vectorize the shuffle for known primitives.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could do effectively the same thing random zone constructor does, which is treat the parameter list from the seeded parameter as 2 entirely different implementations, right? So we could have the shuffle that doesn't take a random do one thing, and the shuffle that does take a random do something completely different. I'm not sure that's any better.
Yeah.
Do we have a shuffle on random already?
We do, yeah.
Yeah, so it would only be the case of I have an enumerable and I want to use my own seeded random and I don't want to instantiate it first. But I feel like there's no way you can do that without instantiating it first because you're going to have to get the count. You're going to have to potentially do repeat enumeration to shuffle for an arbitrary IEnumerable. So functionally all we can do is source to array random dot shuffle output, whatever array was produced, is the intermediate.
Yeah, I think I think the default case is literally going to be two array random dot shared dot shuffle yields all the items. I expect that's what the default implementation will be. I think the only place we could do better, or the main place we would do better, is when shuffle is followed for whatever reason by something else. Take, min, max, element at, to array, to list. Basically all the things that we currently allow you to kind of view in Link's implementation about what came before it. So we literally could specialize, like there's already a path for specializing shuffle.take.toArray. And we could just make that only allocate a 3-element thing that we randomly pick 3 elements from. But
doesn't picking 3 elements still require us to know the length so that we have the full source?
Oh yeah. With this, that wouldn't help in the case of
non-countables.
Non-countable
okay,
inputs. Yeah.
So it's just an optimization for the case of we can get a backing span or iList already. Gotcha.
I mean, even for the non-countable and some of the things we could probably I'm not sure why you would do this. Maybe you were returning a shuffle out of one method and the next method did a min, right? But we could effectively eliminate the shuffle in cases like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if we think that the two-liner is common enough that it's worth putting on Link, I don't want to do, or I don't feel comfortable adding the reservoir sampling. First of all, because we wouldn't know when to say that we've filled a reservoir enough. So if we want to say that the two array call random.shuffle return array is common enough that people want it, because this always is going to have to make a copy. Nothing on Link modifies the source, but random shuffle does modify this because you give it the span and it shuffles it in place. So this is always making a copy. We could put it, but I don't think we need this one. Like I think we can leave off the. If you care about your own RNG, you get to write your own 3-line function.
I'd be okay with that.
I'm pretty sure that would create problems for people wanting to write unit tests around this behavior. But yeah, I get the sentiment.
I mean, once we say that there's a different implementation of the one that doesn't take a random and one that does take a random, adding a random for your unit test purposes has actually defeated your unit. Like you're not testing reality anymore. You think you're testing reality, but you're not. And if you're just saying it's so that you can have your list of things and you have your seeded random so your test is reproducible, then I guess. But again, it's 3 lines, write your own extension method. Which is kind of how I feel about it in the first place.
Add one line to the API usage after bar songs, add random.shared.shuffle songs. Or
Yeah.
new random 42.shuffle songs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. This is insert one line between these two things.
Okay.
That's
I also not sure if we're trying to maintain the same surface area on queryable. What would queryable do with a random instance? Like it couldn't be remoted to the backend in all cases.
Yeah. I don't know that. I don't know that any queryables would have a notion of doing that on the back end.
But I guess that's true for other methods we've shipped already.
Such
Like-
as
Think of aggregate by, for example.
SQL has aggregate by.
Why? Well, why couldn't you do aggregate? I mean, the EF would have expression trees for the comparisons and aggregation functions. But there's no equivalent for random because it's just a concrete instance. So there's no way to say that this is something that the backend would have access to. Or for that matter, something like plink. If we were to add this overload, like there's an open issue for adding all of the APIs that we've added to Link over the years to add them to plink. If you passed in a random instance, plink would need to lock on every access to random. Which is it could do. But...
It seems that you might be able to order by a random function, which in SQL gives you shuffling capabilities, basically.
Oh no, you could do the first line. You could do the first overload. I don't know how you would do the second.
Oh yeah. Oh, no way.
Right.
Or at least you wouldn't be able to do something that is, functionally equivalent to something running locally.
Right. That's I think that's part of my objection to the second overload.
Would we consider, for example, we've never done this anywhere, but taking in a numeric seed as opposed to a random instance, would that be a good proxy that works in Link world?
I mean, again, it's gonna make no sense in queryables.
I guess there's a fighting chance with queryables at least, because you could, the integer could find its way over to the server and impact something on the server, but I don't know what that would look like in all cases. I'd rather just do the first one now, and if we got strong demand for the second, evaluate it in the broader context. Unless we think the only people that are going to use this are, like the majority case requires it to be not deterministic.
I have no such evidence. I think most people care about uniformity.
Sorry, say that again, Eric. I didn't hear you.
I think most users would care about uniformity as opposed to being deterministic in this case.
And Steve, how do you think plink would handle the shuffle that didn't take a random instance?
I think it would use its own. So plink works by basically partitioning the input and trying to maintain partitions for as long as it can. So, it'll break up the input into different groupings, and then it'll process the pipeline across each of the groupings, and then only merge when it absolutely has to. So I imagine it would probably shuffle each partition using its own thread local or shared, thread safe random instance. And then it would also shuffle as part of merging at the end or something like that. Or it would shuffle along the way and then interleave at the end or something like that.
I'm guessing that would be biased by the current partitioning, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it would make sense to aggregate the results before you run a shuffle.
Yeah, I feel like it's going to be the same two array of however that collapses the partitions.
Yeah, I think it's just a question of whether you're two arraying the whole thing or you're two arraying on each partition. I mean, there are plenty of operators in plink that merge. It just significantly limits the usefulness. It's a forced join point where everything stops being in parallel. That said, that's a question for actually implementing this. We don't even have APIs we added years ago like chunk. All the max by, min by, aggregate by, those don't exist.
Okay. Should we be adding the queryable in the same proposal?
I think we should.
Which I think is just copy paste and replace enumerable with queryable.
Right.
And I sync enumerable as well.
Right.
But not parallel enumerable. Because we're waiting on
we haven't been
catch
keeping
up on that.
plink up to date. There's a separate issue that we can address whether we want to add. There's like, I don't know, 20 or something overloads that we don't have on plink that we have on link on System.Linq.Enumerable. So we should consider them all together. Yep.
The queryable should return the queryable, right?
Yeah, line 23 or this 20.
Okay. Good catch.
So to my comment in the previous issue about wanting analyzers, do we want to go and add analyzers for things like looking for, I see people do order by GUID.newGUID and things like that. Do we want to push people to APIs like this from those patterns?
Doing order by GUID.new GUID is something I wouldn't have expected. I mean, there's so many things you can project to get randomness. Like, do we need to try to catch everything under the sun?
No, it would be a best effort.
So GUID, new GUID, and I guess random.next or next double.
Yeah, you could do a grep to see what people are doing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems reasonable. Certainly, once order by is taking or calling to array internally, or spiritually calling to array internally, then shuffle is going to be better than order by GUID new GUID, because that's not asking for 120 random bits for every number.
So linear time algorithm.
I mean, it's still going to be linear, just the constant's going to be much smaller.
Order by.
Chat asks, how can you shuffle an async enumerable?
Same way you shuffle an IEnumerable. You to array it, and then shuffle it.
Yeah. And then I think the reason that we would say it's still returning an async enumerable is, again, for the composition, where if we feel like gluing shuffle and take unaccountable together, we can do something.
Well, also it has to be async in some way. So you're talking either async enumerable or task of IEnumerable, because to consume the source, you're calling to array async, which is an asynchronous operation, and so then it just, like order by and the others, we keep it within the chainable, async enumerable sequence of APIs.
Yeah. And the other use case that came in MEI recently is that you might actually want to feed that final result into something that expects async enumerable in the first place.
Right.
So, for example, streaming server-sent events. So if for whatever reason you wanted to randomly shuffle events and then have them all dumped at the same time in server-sent event format, like, this method will allow you to do that.
Your LLM is making too much sense. You need to confuse the consumer.
Yeah, and then there's the question: wouldn't that mean that the first await might take forever? And yeah, it's the same as with order by and to array and.
Yep. And it's no different from an enumerable.
Yep. It is I would say it's a serializing instruction, but it's not. It's because I assume it's going to return a shuffle enumerator, which is going to delay the work until the first call to move next. So
right, it's lazy until the first move next, at which point it does all the work. That's how order by works, and all the others.
Yep, because they're all, if you don't put a drain on them, they don't do anything. And if you had a side effect in your callbacks, then you get surprised it didn't fire. These don't have callbacks, but I've seen many people do something like just call thing.select and give it a delegate and semicolon, and like, well, why didn't it never call my delegate? It's like, well, you never asked it to. All right. Yeah, I don't know where we'd want to put down creating an analyzer to find common places that could call shuffle, but again, I feel like it's probably going to be one of those. For the getting rid of the calls to GUID, new GUID, that would be performance. Others is probably just going to be, I don't know, maintainability, but we can call the whole thing performance.
Sounds reasonable.
I mean, we can make a note of.
I can open a second issue that I just link from here just so they can be tracked separately, since I imagine this will get done much sooner than the analyzer will. Just
Indeed. Okay. Now let's see what happens if I do this, just to get the timestamps of the next issues right. Okay. Has anybody shown up for any of the items we skipped? Aaron's here.
Same group, I think. Oh,
That was this one. Allow exception marshallers via return marshal using on generated COM interface methods without preserved SIG. 109522.
So this is a pretty simple problem. All we really want to do is handle the case of marshalling an H result to an exception. Now, you may ask yourself, don't we already do that? Yes, we do. But it's a built-in concept, and there's not an obvious way for a user to alter it. Now, the only real case where this matters is CS-WinRT. In practice, by the way, because what they want to do is they want to create the infamous I-restricted error info. So right now, we already call all the machinery in Core CLR to get the exception, convert it to an I error info, and let it go and let it propagate to native code like any other COM interop. But in CS WinRT, in the WinRT environment, I error info was enriched by I restricted error info. The runtime does not want to imbue the runtime with that information. So the only real way to do this is to provide a extension point, which isn't a big deal, because we already have this concept. We just don't have a way of users using it right now. And this provides a way to say, you can write your own marshaller for this H results or exceptions. And so the use case, the example is precisely what it is. The prior art for this is on library import. We have string marshaller. So it's just providing the marshaller type for the interface. In this particular case, we don't think we need a ton of configuration. So this marshaller will be used for all interfaces on this type. So every function that has a every function in the, every method on this COM interface will use this exception handler. That's really the end of it.
Do we already have a notion of what these exception handlers look like? Because I know all this is sort of pattern calls, but I don't see an example of an implementation.
An example of it, so it follows the naming convention here. If you notice, it's like to unmanaged marshaller. The to unmanaged concept is pretty well defined for marshalling.
Right. So is this that they make a in public int or public static int exception to unmanaged takes exception?
Basically, yeah. I think we actually have Jeremy. Can you share where the current exception, the H result marshaller is?
Yes, give me 1 second. It's the exception as H result marshaller type. It's result marshaller. System runtime interop services marshalling exception as H result marshaller. It's generic of T because sometimes people like the way that the runtime implemented it was even if you were returning a long, it would still convert it to an H result because the runtime's COM semantics are weird and not particularly well defined.
So for this one, somebody would say they want type of exception as H result marshaller of int or uint or long or ulong or whatever.
Yeah.
Because you can't infer you wouldn't infer the T from the unbound generic. Or the
we get
unspecified generic.
Yeah, the way that we figure out the T is based on whatever the return type is of the unmanaged return type after marshalling. Then we go put the T in when we do the COM marshalling logic.
Okay, so somebody on this one would, so CS WinRT is just gonna make a public static something convert to unmanaged of exception and do that. This is the shape of the class.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just instead of marshal.get HR for exception, they'll do some of their own exception stuff too, to register the I restricted error info, and then create the H result. that's the main reason for their proposal, is they have some other interaction they need with WinRT's error handle.
All right. Let's take a note on that. Where'd my notes go? All right. Chat asks, should the existing conventions of the attribute be used, such as string marshalling and string marshalling custom type properties?
We don't expect this to have that, like, we don't expect to have kind of any built-in options other than the default experience or a custom one for the whole type. We don't plan to have any more granularity or any sort of like built-in ones for a variety of different options. We expect to have our default experience, and if you need a custom one, you can use the custom setting here. Unlike string marshalling, we do not have a situation where there are multiple valid options for standard com. Like, you want one that does H result. You want one that returns an H result when it's an int and that sort of thing, and does whatever handling needs to be done. But unlike string marshalling, you do not have the option of, do I want UTF-16 or UTF-8? Those are both equally valid options.
Fair enough. All right. Anybody have anything else? Thank you, gentlemen. I don't see anybody else for any of the popped issues. So, expose a way to get either directly to the backing array of an immutable array builder or get it as a span. 111813. Eric, you're up again.
I think I can speak to that. Yeah, so I believe it was back in .NET 9 that we added a method just like this for immutable array in the immutable collections marshal class. So this request is to do the same thing for the builder type. Now, there was a bit of discussion whether we should be returning like the full-blown array contained by the builder, or whether we should be returning a memory or a array segment that contains like the exact values that are currently populated by the builder. But after a bit of conversation, we decided that these two APIs would effectively be equivalent, because you can actually set the count property on the builder type. So, you know, it's possible to obtain one in terms of the other, and given that it's a marshal class, I don't really think we need to have a strong opinion about what this returns. That makes sense?
I assume that this builder class is like list.
Exactly.
So, right, so its elements may be bigger.
Yeah. So
Then the
So it
immutable
might
array
be
would be.
giving you. Yeah, correct. So it would be giving you back an array that could be containing uninitialized elements, but that is still possible today because you can set the count to something big anyways.
Would we consider returning an array segment or a memory of T or something? It feels a little bit inconsistent from the other APIs where, well, I mean, it logically makes sense, but the collection marshal.as span for list of T gives you back a span that's the right size for the data. Immutable collection marshal for an immutable array gives you back the fully sized thing because that's what the array backing immutable array is always full.
Mhm.
I'm just wondering if if this is a pit of failure.
For the case of span specifically, Cyrus, I don't think is in the meeting. He requested that we don't return span because he wanted to be able to use it in context where.
Oh, I wasn't suggesting returning span. I'm highlighting that every other API like this we have gives you back something that includes the length of the stuff that has already been filled in.
Right. So
yeah, from my perspective, I think array segment is probably fine.
Why not memory?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you could still paint the underlying array with array segment, can't you?
You can with memory as well. That was great, Steve.
Sure, but it may or may not be backed by an array, right?
Correct. There's a try get array method that lets you get the array if it's there.
Okay, sure. Like if we feel that this compromises the implementation of immutable array.builder, then memory is fine. But
I mean, logically, I don't know that we could ever change the data structure backing. Well, that's not true. I mean, we could. There are things we could change the immutable array builder to. Like we could have it be a list of arrays or a linked list or whatever, and we only need to produce the array when we create the immutable array. There are other APIs on it that would suffer a little bit, like move to immutable array or move to immutable, whatever that's called. It kind of suggests that
we still wouldn't be able to return memory in that case. Like if we have an API.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like memory wouldn't be sufficient for those.
No,
like the only thing memory would allow us to do that array segment wouldn't is use something else that's contiguous.
Yeah. So the drain to immutable is only non-allocating if you instantiated the builder with a count, or if you got lucky and picked the count that it ended up with. So drain to immutable would still work fine if we changed immutable array to be a vector of arrays. With whatever notion of vector we want to use there. It would be that if you got the number right the first time, we got the first array right, and we never moved on to instantiate the extra arrays to do paging. But yeah, this one, once we had this, we would say we were never going to do that.
Yeah, but then move to immutable throws if count doesn't equal capacity, but I believe we chose the name move because we wanted to convey that it was zero cost, and that's what the compiler kind of depends on around for it.
I scrolled too far, I got drained. So.
We even documented as extracts the internal array.
If it's up the right length.
Yeah. But again, we could switch to a paging model where instead of when you call add and capacity equal count, instead of doing the list thing where we grow the array and add to it, we could do the string builder thing where we just add another buffer and know the order. But yeah, I saw drain, which is the do it if you can, versus move, which is do it or fail. But neither of these would be broken by paging, as long as, we'd have to keep them working. This would be broken by paging. Unless we said that calling it, if it did paging, it collapsed the paging down into one array. I mean, we could do that. The as wouldn't be free in that case.
Yeah, that's what I have to do. It would make as array more expensive, but we could keep it working.
Yeah, the only question that I have on memory versus array segment is I don't know that we've had anything return array segment since um, at least .NET 5. We can, just memory seems to be more the way we go these days. If we want to say array segment to show that it's guaranteed backed by an array, then sure.
Yeah, it's fine. I think, yeah, I think we can.
Just write these notes over here. So presumably we don't want as array as the name once it's a memory.
No.
As memory?
As memory. Collections Marshal uses as span for lists, so I'm splitting.
Are the other Marshall... yeah, none of the Marshall things are extension methods. That'd be stupid. We want you to see the word Marshall. Alright. Anything else? Oh, I should hit comment. Okay. Yep, don't see anybody for the blocking issues. Which means we move down here. So consider adding a clone method to the non-cryptographic hash implementations, .NET Runtime 111908. So on incremental hash, we added clone to get an incremental hash back that's in the same state that you can append different data to, and somebody wants that on all of the non-cryptographic hash algorithms as well.
Or they all keep state internally, right? That we could easily clone.
Yep.
You or Steve might have more context here, but is there kind of guidance on how to write a clone method? I know that iClonable we don't like, but is there guidance that like a clone method is supposed to properly divorce the new object from its parent?
It's supposed to, I mean, I'm not sure if we actually have this written down anywhere, but it would be considered a poor implementation that didn't create something that was at least observably divorced.
Okay.
But you know, if it was referencing some sort of shared immutable state, that would be fine.
Yeah. In this case, they are each going to have like a byte array of state or int array of state or something. They're going to deep clone their state. Otherwise, they would not be clones so much as you made a second reference to the object.
Yeah. Okay.
But we don't have a good should this be deep or shallow. In these cases, it doesn't matter because a depth 1 clone is a fully deep clone.
Right. Okay.
All right. Hearing no objections, sounds like looks good as proposed. ConditionalWeakTable.remove 111925. So this is the remove that outs the item.
Yeah, I can speak to that one as well. So it's basically proposing to add an overload that outs the value.
Seems legit to me, other than I think there's supposed to be a question mark in the signature.
Should be.
I thought that there was no question mark for this case because you want to say it is nullable if it might be nullable if the user didn't specify, otherwise it matches the nullability of whatever the user gave.
Yeah,
because
right.
it's generic.
Right. I think this is the weird case that we never quite remember how it works, and then we just look up whatever we did on, I think, dictionary.
Yeah, try get value is the same. Dictionary.
Okay. And I mean, I think the comment even said it is implemented in terms of this is just not public, so I assume there's no implementation concern with this method. So, any comments?
Looks good. Do we call in the overload of dictionary that has the out parameter? Do we just call it value? No, not like found value or something like that.
Oh, that's a good question.
It's just value.
Okay.
We don't have an overload like that in dictionary, do we?
We do. It's called remove because I was actually checking to see if it was called try remove, but no, it's this overload.
It is called try remove in concurrent dictionary for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Well, concurrent dictionary is better at saying things can fail.
I think it's called remove because I collection of T or I list of T called it just remove with a bool, and it's one of those annoying cases where it's like, I wish we could fix this.
Yeah. So did you successfully look it up and find the name, Levi?
It's value.
Okay.
Oh yeah, as was said earlier, yeah.
Okay.
But what I'm looking at though is I think Tanner, was it you who were just saying that concurrent dictionary and regular dictionary have different overloads for this? One's try remove, one's remove.
No, that was Eric.
Eric, okay.
Yeah. But considering that this is saying we already have public bool remove, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think matching the dictionary of the. This is really a try that didn't use the prefix.
Sure.
All right. So now the nuns. Again, assuming nobody showed up for skipped items. Yep. Default interpolated string handler, expose the buffer and reset 110505.
So I can talk to it. And this has some more decisions we want to make. We've talked about this one in the past, and it's come up several times since. It is useful, and the main objection is whether it's locking us into any kind of future choices. So we have default interpolated string handler, which is the builder that's used by the compiler and system runtime compiler services for implementing interpolated strings. So it's a ref struct. You create one, you append, and then there's a toString and clear method that produces the resulting string. However, there are situations where you'd like to be able to basically use this often as part of another interpolated string implementation, or in supporting interpolated strings, but you don't actually want the string instance. You want to take the data and then do something else with it. You basically want to be able to get the read-only span char that it already has, rather than just producing a string. And so the proposal in the past and now has basically been, let's have, make the internal clear method, make it public, and make the internal text property that has the read-only span of char, make it public as well. And then someone that wants to use it, instead of calling toString and clear, they can access the text and then they can call clear. One of our objections in the past has been, well, default interpolated string handler currently has a contiguous buffer. Would we ever want to maybe move away from that? Kind of like our discussion around immutable array builder a few minutes ago. Which leads to a question of, well, would we want to have a text property like this that would kind of lock us in for the future? Or would we want to have a try get span method, or would we not want to do this at all? That's basically it.
Because so, as we said with the as memory, the text property could be O1 if it's contiguous and do compacting if it's not.
Right.
So it would be forcing it to go back into a contiguous buffer, but it could have been in shards right up until that moment.
That's right.
So it's not
and
fully limiting, it's just surprising.
I think it's unlikely. I mean, most strings that get built up as interpolated strings are not long enough to warrant segmentation. That's not the case for all strings that are used with it, but most. it wouldn't make sense for us to change the implementation to be non-contiguous.
Would the average caller, other than the compiler, ever see the text property or method or whatever we make it be
No, this is buried
without
in
it
compiler
being
services.
completed?
The 99.99% of code never sees an instance of default interpolated string handler.
Right. So, and by the time that we've called some method taking key here in the example, the final call to append has happened.
Correct.
So we don't have the same problem we have with list, where you grabbed the span but then modified it, and now you have no idea what your span is.
Yeah, even less so because it's a ref struct. Like, you'd have to go out of your way to grab the span and then mutate the handler.
Right.
Yeah.
And this one in particular is in compiler services.
Right, but there's nothing weird where you would ever get the initialized state of it and the calls to append haven't happened yet, and then you would inspect it and then the calls to append would happen. Like, you'd have to write that code yourself. The language is never going to do it for you. Because if it could move, then I would say that I have feelings about it being a property versus a method. If it can't move, I probably don't have feelings.
It'd be very unlikely for it to.
Like, somebody would have to call key.append
Yes.
themselves here, which feels
Would be a very weird use case.
unlikely. Yeah. And then I can't think of a reason why we would say we want to encapsulate it with a span action.
No, I think we actively would not want to.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't have super strong feelings on the property versus the method. If we want to be the most hedging against saying we don't violate our own guidelines, that property should be 01, and we want to reserve the right to make a compact on use version later, we would make it be a method. If we say we don't care that this is violating it because it's such a core thing, that then we don't care. But I don't currently see the need for it to be a try pattern.
We could avoid it being a try pattern if we exposed a functionally a property that says here's the number of text chunks that exist and get this chunk number, which would allow the future proofing, and in 99% of cases you just deal with one, but it does allow for the expansion.
It would also make the current implementation more expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, get chunk count would just return 1, and
Oh, sorry. I misunderstood. I thought you were referring to the number of things that were appended.
Yeah. So, sorry, I was saying that if we wanted to support text being non-contiguous, we could, instead of just having try get span, we could have get span chunk and chunk count, basically, and in 99% of cases it's going to be 1 and you only have to 1 call, but then that gives us the flexibility of making it discontiguous if that's ever beneficial in the future. I don't know if that's worth it. That's just something to throw out there as a possible.
Doesn't sound like Steve's biting.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm all for future proofing. I just don't know that this is one where we're really, in practice, going to ever evolve the backing store.
Yeah, and if we did move to chunking later and we wanted to make it where it didn't need to run crunch, then we would just add those at the time.
I guess that might be a reason for preferring the try-get version, because you could have it so that you've got try-get span, and it's simple and assumes contiguous today. We don't have to worry about the possibility of chunks. And users correctly try and do whatever in the case it's not in the case it returns false, and then that allows us to grow in the future to a overload that takes the index that you want to get.
And what do they do when it returns false? Called get string and clear?
Yeah, presumably the same thing that they do with the alternative design already.
It's what you do with the try in the false case, it's much more expensive than what you would be doing if you were just implementing your own implementation. It's like falling off a cliff, but the chances of this ever returning false are pretty slim.
Right. Which is why, like I said, if we're concerned that in the future get underscore text might be more expensive than we wish it would, then we can make it be, the method get text and say one day it might be more expensive, and if it is, then we'll add a way of iterating it so it's not.
Yeah. That seems reasonable too. I don't have any strong preference on any of these.
It just feels like with the try,
like you're a little stuck.
When you're adding the try, you need to understand what somebody would do when it returns false, and if we're saying like, well, we could have compacted the buffer, but instead we're going to allocate a whole string, and then you're like, well, is that what you wanted? Because that's allocating or that's compacting the buffer twice. I mean, I guess not. It could be only once. Yeah. So laziness says the tie goes to what was proposed. If anybody wants to change it to the method get text, that seems fine as well. Or get text span or whatever. Alright. Silence goes to the proposer. Going once. Twice. Sold.
How close are we to being done with our list?
The 2 items that we're blocking that nobody showed up for, and 1 more item. I hope we would get through half, and apparently we're going to burn through everything.
This one should be pretty simple. We added an allows ref struct constraint to IEnumerables T and IAsync enumerables T. There are these helpers we have for using dot configure await and dot with cancellation on IAsync enumerable of T, and we didn't add the constraint there, just because we missed it, and this is suggesting that we add it. I don't really see a downside. There's no, it doesn't box us into any corners, no pun intended. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that these APIs would ever do in the future that this would prohibit.
Okay. It asks, should we do to blocking enumerable at the same time?
That one, I'd have to look at the implementation of. That actually is like a, there's meaningful implementation behind that, and I'd have to look to see what it's doing.
Yeah, it's currently an iterator, which I think means it can't allow a ref struct.
That would prohibit using allows ref struct. So I would say no.
Okay. All right. Any other feedback on this one?
Ship it.
Yeah, I think Steve's explanation was really straightforward.
Just always like to make sure I'm not conflating silence and approval unnecessarily.
No, that's fair.
Alright. And both of these items are complicated and need a representative, and we have no representative for either. So.
Steven, the predefined inline array, that one's not marked ready for review yet, but I feel like the people who are driving it are confident in it. It's just some community discourse on it. Is that one that we could do now, or do you want to wait on that?
I mean, we could make sure folks here are okay with it. I'd like Jan to weigh in on if he has any concerns. Otherwise, I think it's pretty straightforward. We would need to decide what we want the pattern to be for the compiler.
That's 111973 if we do want to do it. Otherwise, we can just wait until Jan gets to it.
We might want to do some more data gathering as well, like to know exactly. We have the data from ASP.NET Core and .NET Core app. And I know you posted some data from some of your projects, but the question is really how many, there's two open questions. How many of these would we want to add for which values? And what would we want the naming pattern to be for the compiler to recognize?
Right. And the general premise behind this is basically the compiler is for param span and stuff, particularly when you've got param span of object or another managed reference type. It wants to be able to implicitly stack allocate behind the scenes. And in order to do that and have the GC track everything correctly, it needs to use an inline array. So much like with many of the compiler attributes that we define in corelib, so that they don't get scattered across every single assembly that the compiler emits. There's a set of common sizes that we want to predefine inline arrays for. And the data that Jared had posted just below shows that some 95% of usages across all of ASP.NET and the .NET libraries is 2, 3, or 4. And then there's a couple that are 5, 7, or 8 as well, for example. But it's basically, we don't want to expose everything, only the ones that are meaningful to the compiler to avoid the bloat across every assembly that Roslyn emits.
Yeah, for what it's worth, when I talked to Fred about this, I said the inline array in, where in is the number of elements in it, and that we should add up to 3 sigma, which I assume will be 9. Just so we don't add, 5 of them now, and then next year be like, well, it turns out 6 is actually a relatively common number too. It's like, no, I don't want to hear I don't want to hear this again for like 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the community discourse on this is, there's some community members that are like, why are you exposing this instead of something like const generics, where you can just say inline array T2 or something like that. And there was some back and forth discussion around how that's not really impactful to typical use cases. I gave some numbers, for example, my own TerraFX interrupt bindings, where there's 1,023 unique usages of inline array, and they boil down to some like 20 different sizes. But they aren't something that you'd want to use a common type for anyways. You'd really want to use the specific type because of the specialization for the domain and scenario. So that the benefits of having something like that and having to redefine the entire type system don't justify the effort necessarily.
Does inline array mean it's implicitly convertible to span or something?
Yes.
I was wondering why they didn't define that they were convertible to spans. So yeah, I mean, unless there's supposed to be some other magic thing that does it, my personal stance is the same way that we took action up to 12 or 15 parameters when we don't think anybody should ever go that high. We should figure out what the number is here of you've gone off the deep end, and do it in just one shot. Unless runtime wants to argue that inline array of 12 is complicated, but I doubt they would. So, yeah, this will get a nod from me whenever, or if it comes in final this way. Anybody want to say otherwise so we can shape it before it comes in? Good talk. All right. Anybody have any other pre-discussion, or you quickly mark something ready for review items, or do we get 20 minutes back? Going once? Twice?
I'll take the 20 minutes, please.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We're only left with blocking issues that we needed extra representation for, and I assume we'll do those next week. This Thursday there will be a meeting at 10 o'clock Redmond time for first high-level concept review of Microsoft Extensions AI. I think the calendar's broken right now. That'll probably get fixed soon. Yep, an error occurred. So, yeah, there will be this Thursday, 10 o'clock. I assume we're streaming it. Otherwise, I shouldn't have mentioned it. And we'll see you then. Otherwise, see you next Tuesday. Same .NET time, same .NET channel. Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye bye.